Welcome to Ecology Matters, a podcast from the Ecological Society of Australia, featuring ecologists from all over the country.
The biodiversity in this part of the world is just incredible.
It's not just ice and snow, it's teeming with life on the coast.
I see that and I say, okay, well, that's a great opportunity to study it more.
Looking at those sites gives you a sense of joy and hope.
Love being around. It's incredible.
It's just, it's a really awesome program, and it's just so healing, like, for our whole community.
It's the beauty of ecology is that it's so interconnected.
Yeah, it's been really exciting, actually.
A picture is worth 1,000 words, or so the saying goes. Our guest this episode is looking at precisely this idea. What role do wildlife images play in conservation? How can images influence public attitudes and behaviours towards wildlife? And what effect does this have on long-term wildlife conservation? Meghan Shaw is a PhD candidate at Deakin University looking into these big picture ideas. You're currently doing your PhD looking at the role of wildlife imagery in conservation. Can you talk a little bit about why images are such a powerful tool for conveying messages?
Yeah, so there's a few different reasons that they're so powerful, and also why they're so misunderstood at the moment. So when we look at a conversation, for example, or even a written sentence, we have a syntax. So there's like grammatical rules that we follow or words that we know the meaning of. And so that helps us to convey meaning on a cultural sense, as well as just at its face value. But images don't have that same syntax. So what people see in an image is much more up to their interpretation than it is when it's just text or just the spoken word. We also know that images have a really strong impact on how people remember things. So people are more likely to remember images than they are to remember text or sound. And also they're more likely to link those to emotions as well, because the memory has such a strong link to emotions. We remember things that make us feel something as well.
And if we're talking about the impact of images on public attitude and behaviour, I know that you've looked at this as part of your research. What have you found in terms of particular images and how they influence public attitude and behaviour?
There's a whole bunch of different ways that different images can impact behaviour and attitudes towards wildlife. So the classic would be things like your really negative imagery, so death imagery, graphic imagery. They have a really strong emotional effect on people, and so therefore produce a really strong attitude towards the wildlife that they depict as well. So for example, when we see photos of animals that have been hunted, we tend to have a really strong reaction to that, and therefore that strong reaction then leads to us being more likely to perform a behaviour that's related to hunting, for example. So signing a petition that says, I don't want hunting, like the duck hunting example at the moment in the Victorian Parliament. There are other things. So we are really impacted by certain species. So we tend to have a stronger connection to mammals and birds. So the things that look a bit more like humans. And so we tend to find our emotions drawn by those a lot more and form more of an emotional connection towards those. Although we are starting to see that that's happening more with some of our more, creepy crawlies as well. So that's just a couple of examples.
So when you started looking at organisations and their marketing efforts around wildlife conservation, what did you discover about the images that they're favouring, in their marketing campaigns and their social media?
So there's a huge taxonomic bias. So we do tend to see more images of mammals and birds, particularly when it's birds, it's bright coloured birds. And then we don't really have much of a representation of reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. So it's not really reflecting the biological diversity that's out there. We are seeing a lot of images as well of people with wildlife. And there are some interesting impacts that can have. So, for example, if we see a photo of somebody feeding a kangaroo in the wild, that can then send the message that that's an appropriate behaviour to do. And in some contexts, specifically if it's a wild kangaroo, that's not something that we should be encouraging.
does it influence how people, see them as a wild species versus something that they may want to have interactions with in their everyday life?
I think so. So there's not a whole lot of information on that, but again, we only know about the species that we're exposed to, right? So if we're constantly seeing photos of specific mammals and specific birds, those are the animals that we're going to recognize and the animals that we're going to kind of form a connection towards, want to donate more towards, want to see more. So yes, I think there's probably a link between that.
So what effect does that taxonomic bias, we're saturated by images of mammals and birds, particularly the cute and cuddly ones or the colourful ones. What sort of effect does that have on long-term wildlife conservation? So you just mentioned there about people tending to donate more to the animals, the species that they're familiar with. Does it have a long-term effect, and does that spill over into other aspects of wildlife conservation?
There's not a whole lot of research out there on this, so I think it'd be something that would be really interesting to look at in more detail. Apart from the donation example, the animals, this is more of a negative turn on it, but the animals that we're more likely to see through like conservation messaging might also be the animals that people are more likely to want as an exotic pet as well, because they're the animals that they know about, they're the famous animals, they kind of have that reputation. There's also a taxonomic bias in the attention that a government's more likely to give towards certain species as well. And obviously the decisions that the government make in terms of what species they're more likely to give money towards, support the research of, be concerned with the conservation of, are linked to public interest. So if the public interest is surrounding mammals and birds, then those are the species that are more likely to be conserved. And there's so little data on some of the species that aren't in the public interest. So if they don't have a really strong ecological role and they're not something that the public is really interested in or sees as like a thematic species or a species that they really value, a lot of the time there's not a lot of research out there on even population sizes or behaviour.
And is there any research to make us think that a sustained communication program or a marketing campaign might change some of those public attitudes if people are not particularly engaged with a certain subset of species? Can that be changed by seeing it more regularly or seeing it in a more positive light?
Yeah, it definitely can. So the research that I've done with Deakin University had a look at how people engage with different Instagram posts featuring different species. And we basically found that engagement levels, so things like likes and the number of comments on a photo, aren't really impacted by species that much. So yes, mammals do have a higher engagement, but not by a lot. And then from then on, every single taxonomic level, there was no significant difference in the amount of engagement that they received. So birds were just as likely to be engaged with to the same level as reptiles, for example. We also know that the way that the communication is done is really important. So a sustained marketing effort, so more attention put onto a lesser known species, does increase the public's affinity for or like for that species and their donations towards it. Interestingly, there's also a downside to showing a certain species regularly on social media or regularly in the media. So the more that we see a species, the more likely we are to kind of form a population of them in our minds. So the classic example would be a tiger, for example. So you see images of tigers all the time. They're on social media, they're on cereal packets, they're on cartoons. And so we can start to kind of form an idea that the species isn't endangered because we're seeing it so much that we kind of think, oh, well, there's plenty of them out in the wild if I'm seeing that species so much. So if you show a species too much, specifically like your charismatic species that are everywhere, then that can also impact the conservation of it because we think that there's enough of them, we don't need to conserve them when actually there isn't.
Yeah, and insects, I guess, is the other one that around us, we often see lots and lots of them and don't realise just how fast they're declining.
Exactly. The other example would be flying foxes. So we pay attention to a big roost of flying foxes because they're loud, they're noisy, they're right there. And therefore, it's very difficult to kind of think about that species as on the decline when you're seeing big groups of them and paying attention to big groups of them. But there are different ways that you can kind of market that species as well that will impact that success. So we as humans love to relate to something. So if there's some sort of characteristic of a species that we can relate to, it might not be looks, it could be behavior, it could be like the story of the underdog, it could be, I know in science we hate the word anthropomorphism, but a lot of the time in conservation marketing, if it's done in a responsible way that's not encouraging people to perform behaviours that are going to negatively impact wildlife, it can be a really strong thing for getting people to care about an animal. And then there's also the impact of a species in terms of its cultural values. So if it's really important to a specific culture or a specific person, hearing the stories around why that person values that species, the experiences they've had with them, or that the culture has had with that species, is also a really good kind of driver of public support.
I guess, you're talking about finding a way to finding a hook for people to relate to certain species. I guess a classic example would be the spiders, wouldn't it? That most people have a sort of a negative reaction to spiders, but everybody loves peacock spiders because they're colourful and they're cute and they perform those amazing dance moves. So
exactly. So there's so many things there that we can relate to. Another one that I haven't mentioned as well is the uniqueness of a species. So with a peacock spider, obviously the bright colors are something that attracts people, but it's also something that's quite unique about that spider. So its uniqueness and its rarity can also be a really good quality that you can kind of market, I guess, to get people supporting a species. Yeah. So if we're talking about putting a series of tips together, if you like, for conservation organizations, social media managers and other people that are in charge of the imagery that is promoted, what would you be recommending? What would you like these sorts of organizations, what would you be hoping that they would start to take on board into the future? I think the first one is don't be afraid to post something other than a mammal and other than a charismatic species that the public already knows. The research that we've done at Deakin has shown that it doesn't impact the engagement that you're getting with your content. And you are raising the profile of species that the public may not know about or may not have valued so far. So you could be doing something really good for them. The other one that I would say would be try to avoid having people in photographs with wildlife. So sending messages about behaviours that could be dangerous to either the person or dangerous to the animal itself. Again, we found that there's no impact on the level of engagement that those photos have. So if they don't need to be there, then they don't need to be there. Focus it more on the animal itself. And then the third one would be try and find something with the species that you're showcasing that people can relate to. So whether it be the behavior of the species, whether it be a story about the species, whether it be about somebody's relationship with that species or somebody's experience with that species, they're all really good stories that you can tell to get people to care more about the animal. I think you've just touched on it really well there, but is there any other way that you see your research being used or applied into the future? I think social media in general it's an ever-changing landscape. And so currently the research is just coming out about imagery, but we don't know much about video. So video in particular has not only imagery, but it has a full-on narrative. So the narrative is a storyline that's being told with visuals. And so I think that will be really interesting to kind of see how those two things tie together. So the messaging strategies and the different images. I also think at the moment there's a huge bias in the conservation messaging and marketing research towards Western cultures. And that kind of needs to be changed. So we need to see more research going on in, not just your classic like university students or your American public or white social media users. So I'd really like to see how those imagery studies change and how the results change depending on the audience that's seeing the imagery as well.
Ecology Matters is a podcast by the Ecological Society of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation supporting ecologists and ecological science in Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. To learn more about our work, follow us on social media, visit our website or sign up to our newsletter. You can find links to these in the show notes. The theme music is Glow by Scott Buckley. Lastly, thank you to all the ecologists who have taken part in this series and shared their perspectives on why ecology matters.